The rain in Oregon does not wash things clean, it just makes the dirt harder to see. I stood by the open grave and watched the water darken the gray slate of the headstone. My shoes were sinking slightly into the soft mud, but I did not move. I had spent 40 years working for the IRS as a forensic accountant, and if there is one thing I learned, it is how to stand perfectly still and watch until someone makes a mistake. Marcus was gone. That was the fact I had to write in the ledger of my life. My husband of 30 years, the man who made me laugh when the world was gray, had suffered a massive heart attack on the tennis court. It was sudden, and it was final. But as I looked around the cemetery, I realized that grief was not the only thing in the air. There was tension. There was ambition. And there was the distinct smell of expensive cologne coming from the man standing next to me. Caleb Thorne wiped a fake tear from his eye. He was Marcus's nephew, the son of his late sister, and he was the closest thing we had to a child. But Caleb was not a child anymore. He was 44 years old and wearing a bespoke Italian suit that I knew cost more than the car I drove. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, checking his watch when he thought no one was looking. He was impatient. He wanted the morning to be over so the business could begin. I adjusted my black veil and looked at him. Caleb had been running the day-to-day operations of Marcus's logistics company for the past 5 years. He was charming and handsome in a sharp, wolfish way, and he could sell snow to a shivering man. Marcus had loved him blindly. Marcus saw the potential, but I saw the red flags. I saw the way Caleb's eyes darted around a room assessing the value of everything he saw. Even now, at his uncle's funeral, he wasn't looking at the coffin. He was looking at the board members standing in the back row. He was counting votes. Caleb leaned down to me and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. He told me that I needed to rest. He said that this was too much for me, and that he would handle everything. His voice was smooth like oiled leather, but I heard the condescension dripping underneath. He saw an old woman. He saw a grieving widow who needed to be patted on the head and sent to bed with a cup of tea. He had forgotten who I was before I retired. He had forgotten that I used to hunt tax evaders and embezzlers for a living. I didn't just look at numbers, I interrogated them until they confessed. I told him I was fine. I kept my voice steady and dry. I watched his hand linger on my shoulder a second too long, as if he were trying to weigh me down to keep me in my place. The reception was held at our house. It was a sprawling estate on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Marcus had bought it 10 years ago when the company finally hit the big time. I always felt it was too big for just the two of us, but Marcus loved the status of it. Now it felt like a museum. People milled around holding crystal glasses of wine, eating tiny crab cakes, and whispering about the future of the company. I sat in my favorite armchair in the corner and just watched. I watched Caleb corner the CFO by the fireplace. I saw the way Caleb used his hands when he spoke, chopping the air aggressively. I saw the CFO look down at his shoes, looking uncomfortable. My stomach tightened. That was a tell. In my line of work, looking at your shoes usually meant you were hiding something, or you were afraid of the person asking the questions. Later that evening, the lawyer arrived. His name was Mr. Sterling, and he had been the family attorney for decades. He looked tired. He asked us to gather in the library for the reading of the will. It was just me, Caleb, and a few witnesses. The room smelled of old paper and the leather of Marcus's chair. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. I expected this to be standard procedure. Marcus and I had discussed it years ago. The house would be mine, the majority shares would be mine, and Caleb would continue to run the company with a generous salary. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and avoided making eye contact with me. That was the second red flag of the day. He began to read. The first few paragraphs were standard legalese. But then came the distribution of assets. Mr. Sterling read that the primary residence, the estate on the cliff, along with 80% of the company shares, were to be bequeathed to Caleb Thorne. The room went silent. The only sound was the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. I simply froze. I looked at Mr. Sterling and asked him to repeat that. He looked pained. He said that Marcus had updated his will 6 months ago. He said Marcus felt that since Caleb was the future of the company, he needed full control of the assets to secure financing for a global expansion. And then came the part that felt like a slap across the face. To my loving wife, Elara, the will read, I leave the lakeside cabin at Blackwood Lake and a monthly stipend of $2,000. $2,000. That wouldn't even cover the property taxes on the cabin. And the cabin itself was a wreck. It was a place Marcus bought 20 years ago for fishing trips, but we hadn't been there in a decade. It was rotting wood and drafts and isolation. I looked at Caleb. He was doing a terrible job of hiding his smile. He looked solemn, but his eyes were dancing. He leaned forward and told me that he knew it was a shock. He said that Uncle Marcus had been worried about my health and didn't want me burdened with the stress of the big house and the company. He said he would take care of the estate and that I would be much happier at the lake where it was quiet. Burdened. That was the word he used, as if managing my own home was too difficult for my feeble, female brain. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, but I kept my back straight. I walked over to the desk and asked to see the document. Mr. Sterling slid it toward me. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was Marcus's signature. It was shaky, but it was his. But the date caught my eye. It was signed 6 months ago on a day when Marcus had been in the hospital for a minor procedure. He had been medicated. I looked up at Caleb. He was watching me like a hawk watches a field mouse. He was waiting for me to break down, to cry, to beg him to let me stay in the house. He expected the grieving widow. Instead, I felt a cold calm wash over me. It was the same feeling I used to get when I opened a box of disorganized receipts and knew that someone was trying to hide a yacht purchase in the office supply budget. This didn't add up. Marcus loved Caleb, but he was not a fool. He knew Caleb was impulsive. Giving him everything and leaving me with scraps was not something Marcus would do unless he was coerced, or unless he was not in his right mind. I looked at Caleb and I saw it. The arrogance. The slight tilt of his head that said I won and you lost. He thought he had cleared the board. He thought he had removed the only obstacle in his way. He thought he could pack me off to a rotting cabin in the woods and I would just fade away into the wallpaper. I closed the folder and handed it back to Mr. Sterling. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I smoothed the front of my black dress and looked Caleb directly in the eyes. I told him that I would need a few days to pack my things. Caleb nodded graciously. He said, "Take all the time you need, Aunt Elara. I'll have the movers help you." He thought he was being generous. He thought he was being kind. But as I walked out of the library and into the rain-soaked night, I wasn't thinking about the furniture I would lose or the ocean view I would miss. I was thinking about the numbers. I was thinking about the shaky signature. I was thinking about the terrified look on the CFO's face. There was red ink all over this situation. And if there is one thing I cannot tolerate, it is an unbalanced ledger. Caleb Thorne had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated the woman who taught him how to count. The eviction was polite, but it was still an eviction. Caleb did not throw my clothes onto the lawn or change the locks while I was at the grocery store. He was far too concerned with appearances for that. Instead, he sent a personal assistant named Jessica to hover over me while I packed. She was a young woman with a tight ponytail and a clipboard who kept asking if I needed help lifting the heavy boxes. I knew what she was really doing. She was making sure I didn't take anything that belonged to the estate. She was watching to ensure the silver candlesticks and the first edition books stayed exactly where they were. I was allowed to take my clothes, my personal jewelry, and the kitchen items Marcus had bought before the marriage. Everything else was now company property. I packed my life into cardboard boxes and listened to the rain hammer against the bay windows of the house I had managed for 30 years. It is a strange feeling to be erased from your own home. The rooms echoed as the rugs were rolled up not for me to take, but for Caleb to replace. He had told me he wanted a more modern aesthetic. He wanted glass and steel and sharp edges. He wanted to erase the warmth Marcus and I had built. The drive to Blackwood Lake took 2 hours, and every mile felt like a demotion. The road wound away from the coast and into the dense, dripping forests of the interior. The trees here were ancient and covered in moss, hanging like ragged beards from the branches. The air grew colder, and the smell of the ocean was replaced by the smell of wet earth and pine needles. When I finally turned onto the gravel driveway of the cabin, the car bottomed out in a pothole that rattled my teeth. The cabin sat on the edge of the water, looking like a forgotten thought. It was a single-story structure made of dark timber that had turned gray with age. The porch sagged on the left side, and the roof was thick with pine needles. It looked like a place where things went to die. I sat in the car for a long moment with the engine running and the heater blasting. I could have cried. A younger version of me might have wept at the injustice of it all. But tears do not pay the bills, and they certainly do not fix leaking roofs. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the mud. The inside was worse than the outside. The air was stale and cold, heavy with the scent of mildew and neglect. It smelled like a house that had been holding its breath for 10 years. There was a layer of dust on every surface thick enough to write your name in. I walked through the small living room and into the kitchen. The linoleum was peeling at the corners, and the refrigerator hummed with a loud, angry rattle. This was my inheritance. This was what my life had been reduced to. I spent the first 2 days scrubbing. I scrubbed until my hands were raw and my back ached. I needed to impose order on the chaos. That has always been my way. When the numbers don't add up, you go back to the beginning and you check every single entry until you find the error. Cleaning was my way of checking the entries. I washed the windows so the gray light could come in. I swept the cobwebs from the corners. I made the place habitable, but I could not make it home. On the 3rd day, the rain intensified. It was a deluge that turned the lake into a churning gray soup. I was trapped inside with nothing but the sound of the wind and my own thoughts. I decided to tackle the attic. Marcus had used the cabin for storage long before he got sick. He had moved boxes of old tax returns and business files out here years ago, claiming he didn't want the clutter in the main house. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now I wondered if there was a reason he wanted these things so far away from prying eyes. The attic stairs were steep and narrow. I pulled the string for the light bulb, and a single yellow globe flickered to life, casting long shadows against the slanted ceiling. The space was crammed with boxes. Most of it was useless. Old fishing gear with rusted hooks, broken lamps, a collection of National Geographic magazines from the 90s. But in the far corner, under a tarp that was stiff with dust, I found a stack of banker's boxes. They were labeled in Marcus's handwriting. Fiscal years 2018-2022. I sat down on a dusty trunk and opened the first box. I expected to find boring invoices and shipping manifests. I expected the mundane paperwork of a logistics company, and at first, that is what I found. But as I dug deeper, I found something else. Tucked between the official folders were small black notebooks. Marcus was old-fashioned. He trusted computers, but he trusted pen and paper more. He used to say that a hard drive could crash, but ink was forever. I opened the notebook dated 3 years ago. It was a personal ledger. Marcus had been tracking the accounts receivable for the company manually. He had been double-checking the work of the finance department. I started to read, and my breath caught in my throat. The numbers in the notebook did not match the numbers I remembered seeing in the annual reports. Marcus had noted specific shipments that were flagged as lost in transit or damaged goods. Beside each entry, he had written a question mark and the initials CT Caleb Thorne. I forgot about the cold. I forgot about the dust. I sat there for hours, turning the pages. It was a forensic accountant's dream and a wife's nightmare. Marcus had seen the pattern. He had seen that every time Caleb took over a new division, the operational costs spiked and the write-offs increased. Caleb wasn't just skimming off the top. He was orchestrating complex losses to cover up theft. He was selling inventory out the back door and writing it off as damaged. But then I found the entry that made my blood run cold. It was dated 8 months ago. 2 months before Marcus changed his will. Marcus had written confronted C today. He denied it. He got angry. Said I didn't understand the modern market. Said I was getting old and confused. He threatened to tell the board that I was losing my mind, that I was unfit to lead. I stared at the words. Caleb had gaslighted him. He had used Marcus's fear of aging against him. He had convinced my husband that his own competence was slipping. And then he must have convinced him to sign over the assets as a way to protect the legacy. It was coercion, pure and simple. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest. My hands were trembling, but not from the cold. I looked around the dark attic. This wasn't just a pile of junk. This was a crime scene. Caleb thought he had sent me to a garbage dump to rot. He thought he had buried me, but he had made a fatal calculation error. He had sent the auditor to the archives. I stood up and dusted off my pants. I took the box of notebooks and carried it downstairs. I placed it on the kitchen table next to my cup of cold tea. The rain was still hammering against the roof, but I didn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was the sound of a fight beginning. Caleb had the house. He had the money. He had the lawyers. But I had the truth. And in my experience, the truth is the most dangerous asset of all, if you know how to leverage it. I went to the drawer and found a red pen. I opened the first notebook again. I had work to do. I needed internet access, and I needed it somewhere Caleb couldn't track. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, and the phone line was dead, which I suspected was not an accident. I drove my 10-year-old sedan into town, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the drizzle. The town of Oakhaven was a tourist trap in the summer, but in the off-season, it was a ghost town of shuttered saltwater taffy shops and gray boardwalks. My first stop was the First National Bank. I walked in shaking my umbrella and smiling at the security guard. I wore a beige raincoat and a scarf tied under my chin. I looked harmless. I looked like a woman who was there to deposit a Social Security check and complain about the weather. I asked to see the branch manager. Mr. Henderson was a man I had known for years. He was a nervous little man who always wore bow ties that were slightly too tight. When he saw me, his face went pale. He ushered me into his glass-walled office and offered me a peppermint from a crystal bowl. He didn't offer me coffee, which told me he wanted this meeting to be short. I played the part. I sat on the edge of the chair clutching my purse and told him I was just so confused about the accounts. I told him I couldn't remember if Marcus had transferred the dividend payments to my personal checking or the joint savings. I watched his eyes. They darted to his computer screen and then back to me. He licked his lips. He told me that Caleb had restructured the accounts recently. He said that everything was now consolidated under the corporate umbrella for tax efficiency. He used big words trying to dazzle me with jargon. He didn't know that I had written the book on tax efficiency for the IRS training manual in 1992. I nodded vacantly and asked if that meant the dividends were delayed. I mentioned that the roof at the cabin was leaking and I needed cash. Mr. Henderson sighed. He lowered his voice and leaned in. He told me that liquidity was a bit tight at the moment due to the upcoming merger. He said that once the sale to the Omnicorp conglomerate went through, everything would be flush again. He told me to just be patient for another month. I froze. A merger. Caleb wasn't just running the company, he was selling it. He was trying to cash out. I thanked Mr. Henderson and took a peppermint. I walked out of the bank with my heart hammering against my ribs. Selling the company was the ultimate exit strategy. If Caleb sold to a massive conglomerate like Omnicorp, the internal books would be buried in the transition. The embezzlement would be written off as legacy inefficiencies or lost in the shuffle of data migration. He would walk away with millions, and the evidence of his theft would vanish. I needed to see the numbers. I drove to the public library, a brick building that smelled of damp wool and floor wax. I found a computer terminal in the back corner, away from the prying eyes of the librarian. I logged on to the public records database. This was where I did my best work. People think that secrets are hidden in safes, but most secrets are hidden in plain sight in public filings and UCC statements if you know where to look. I started searching for liens against the company assets. The screen flickered with green text. It was worse than I thought. Caleb had taken out 3 separate loans against the company's warehouse inventory in the last 6 months. He was leveraging the business to the hilt. He was borrowing money to cover the holes he had dug. Then I pulled up the pending sale documents. The letter of intent from Omnicorp was filed 30 days ago. They were in the due diligence phase. That was the window. That was the vulnerability. During due diligence, the buyer sends their own auditors to check the books. If they found the discrepancies, the deal would collapse. Caleb must be terrified. He was likely cooking the books frantically, trying to make the numbers look solid for the Omnicorp team. I sat back in the hard plastic chair. A young man at the next computer was playing a video game, blasting electronic noises through his headphones, but I barely heard it. I was in the zone. I was visualizing the flow of money like water in pipes. Caleb had drained the reservoir, and now the inspectors were coming to check the levels. He was pumping air into the pipes to make them look full. He needed a distraction. He needed to make sure that no one looked too closely at the past 5 years. And he needed to make sure the one person who could decipher his creative accounting, me, stayed silent and invisible in the woods. That was why he sent me to the cabin. It wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. He needed me off the board. I logged out of the computer and wiped the history. I walked out of the library and stood on the steps, breathing in the cold, wet air. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a bruised purple. I felt a surge of energy that I hadn't felt in years. It was the thrill of the hunt. Caleb thought he was the predator and I was the prey. He thought he was the shark and I was the minnow. But he was wrong. He was the virus and I was the antibody. I got back into my car. I wasn't going to just wait for the roof to leak. I needed to get into the system. I needed the encryption keys to the offshore accounts that Marcus had hinted at in his journals. If I could find where the money actually went, I could blow the Omnicorp deal out of the water. I could expose him not just as a bad businessman, but as a criminal. I remembered something from the journal. Marcus had written, "The key is in the foundation." At the time, I thought he was being metaphorical, talking about the foundation of the company. But as I drove back toward the dark, rotting cabin, I wondered if he was being literal. The cabin was the only thing Marcus had left me. The cabin was the only thing Caleb didn't want until he realized he might need it. I pulled into the driveway. The headlights cut through the gloom and illuminated the sagging porch. It looked like a haunted house, But for the first time, it didn't look like a prison. It looked like a puzzle box. Somewhere in that rotting wood was the evidence that would destroy Caleb Thorne. I turned off the engine. The silence of the woods rushed in. I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I was the one bringing the light. And Caleb Thorne was about to find out that you should never try to cheat an auditor on her final balance sheet. The next morning, I didn't start with coffee. I started with a flashlight and a crowbar I found in the rusted toolbox under the sink. Marcus's note in the journal, "The key is in the foundation," kept looping in my mind like a broken record. I went outside. The air was crisp and smelled of damp pine needles and impending rain. The cabin sat on concrete pilings, raising it about 3 feet off the soggy ground. A lattice of rotting wood skirting hid the crawl space underneath. I knelt in the mud, feeling the dampness seep through the knees of my jeans. I pried a section of the lattice loose. It came away with a wet groan of old nails. I shined the flashlight into the gloom. It was a spider's paradise down there, thick with webs and the scuttling sounds of things with too many legs. I really hoped Marcus hadn't literally buried something in the dirt. I crawled in on my elbows, dragging myself through the muck. The clearance was low, and the smell of mold was overpowering. I scanned the concrete pilings. They were rough gray blocks, unremarkable in every way. I moved deeper under the house until I was directly beneath what would be the kitchen. And then I saw it. One of the concrete blocks on the central support pillar looked different. It was smoother, lighter in color. And there was a small metal loop embedded in the side, almost invisible against the gray stone. I hooked the crowbar into the loop and pulled. It didn't budge. I braced my feet against another piling and pulled with everything I had, grunting with the effort. With a sudden scrape of stone on stone, a false panel slid away. Behind it was a small waterproof safe box. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dragged the box out into the daylight, my hands shaking. I sat on the porch steps, wiping the mud from the plastic casing. It was a fireproof document safe, the kind you buy at an office supply store, but heavy. It was locked with a digital keypad. I tried Marcus's birthday. Nothing. I tried our anniversary. Nothing. I tried the date he founded the company. The red light blinked mockingly. I had 3 attempts left before it locked me out for 24 hours. I closed my eyes and thought about Marcus. Not the businessman, not the public figure, but the man who sat across from me at breakfast for 40 years. What was the number that mattered most to him? What was the number that Caleb wouldn't know? I remembered a trip we took to Italy in 1985. We had stayed in a small villa in Tuscany. It was the happiest week of our lives. We had talked about retiring there. The villa number was 4228. It was obscure. It was personal. I typed it in. 4028. The light turned green. The latch clicked. Inside, there was no cash. There were no gold bars. There was a single USB drive and a laminated piece of paper with a long string of alphanumeric characters. A crypto wallet key. And underneath that, a deed. I unfolded the deed. It wasn't for the cabin. It was for the land the cabin sat on. But as I read the survey coordinates, my eyes widened. The property lines didn't just include the small plot around the cabin. They extended half a mile into the lake and importantly included a strip of land that ran parallel to the main highway. I realized what I was looking at. Years ago, the state had proposed a new access road to bypass the town traffic. If that road was ever built, it would have to go through this land. Marcus had bought the rights, hoping the state would buy him out for millions. The project had been shelved, but rumors were it was back on. But that wasn't the leverage. The leverage was the digital file. I took the USB drive inside and plugged it into my laptop, which I had charged at the library. It opened a folder titled Project Icarus. I clicked the first file. It was a spreadsheet. It detailed a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands: Blue Heron Logistics, Thorn Consulting, Coastal Obscure Holdings. All of them listed Caleb Thorne as the beneficial owner. And all of them had received monthly transfers from Marcus's company labeled as consulting fees. Millions of dollars, siphoned out right under the board's nose. Suddenly, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved the safe box under the couch cushions. I stood up and smoothed my sweater, trying to slow my breathing. Through the window, I saw a sleek black Range Rover pull up next to my battered sedan. The door opened and Caleb stepped out. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater and designer jeans, looking like a model for a weekend getaway catalog. He didn't look like a man under investigation. He looked like a man who owned the world. He walked up the porch steps and knocked. I waited a beat, then opened the door. "Aunt Elara," he said, flashing that charming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was in the area, thought I'd check on you. See how you're settling in." "I'm fine, Caleb," I said, blocking the doorway. "Just doing some cleaning." He tried to peer past me into the cabin. "It looks rustic." "Listen, Elara, I've been thinking. This place is in terrible shape. The roof alone will cost a fortune to fix. And honestly, it's not safe for a woman of your age to be out here alone." "I'm perfectly safe," I lied. "I want to help," he said, his voice dropping to a tone of faux concern. "I spoke to the board. We're willing to buy the property back from you at a premium, $300,000, cash. You could get a nice condo in the city, be closer to your friends." $300,000. The land alone was worth 5 times that if the road project went through. But he didn't care about the road. He cared about what was hidden here. Had he found out about the safe? Did he know Marcus hid the evidence here? "Why would the company want a rotting cabin?" I asked, playing the confused widow. "Sentimental value," he said quickly. Too quickly. "Marcus loved this place. We want to preserve it as a company retreat." He was lying. His eyes were shifting. He was nervous. "That's very generous, Caleb," I said slowly. "But I think I'll stay. It has sentimental value for me, too." His smile faltered. A flicker of anger crossed his face. "Elara, be reasonable. You can't maintain this place. It's going to fall down around your ears." "Then let it fall," I said. "It's all I have left." He took a step closer, invading my personal space. The charm evaporated. "Don't be difficult, Elara. Take the money. It's a good offer. You don't want to make things harder for yourself, do you?" It was a threat. Thinly veiled, but a threat nonetheless. I looked him in the eye. "I'm not selling, Caleb. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lot of cleaning to do." I started to close the door. He put his hand on it for a second, resisting. For a moment, I thought he was going to force his way in, but then he pulled his hand back. He smoothed his hair and regained his composure. "Think about it," he said, cold as ice. "The offer stands for 24 hours. After that, well, I can't guarantee the company will be so generous." He turned and walked back to his car. I watched him drive away, the tires spinning aggressively in the gravel. He was scared. He didn't just want the land. He needed it. Maybe he knew the evidence was here, or maybe he needed the land to secure the loan from Omnicorp. Either way, I had something he needed. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt. My hands were shaking again. I went back to the couch and pulled out the safe box. I looked at the USB drive. I had the gun. Now I just needed to load it. I was going to leak a rumor. I was going to make him think the land was worth millions, not because of the evidence, but because of something else. I was going to make him desperate. Because when men like Caleb get desperate, they make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, I would be there to catch them. Information travels faster than light in a small town. In Oak Haven, the fastest conductor of information was not the fiber optic cable, but a woman named Brenda who ran the counter at the Salty Spoon Diner. Brenda knew who was cheating on whom before the spouses did, and she knew who was selling their house before the sign went up. She was exactly who I needed. I walked into the diner at 11 in the morning. It was the lull between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd. The air smelled of bacon grease and stale coffee. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a slice of cherry pie. I looked flustered. I made sure my hands were shaking just enough to be noticeable when I picked up my fork. "You okay, Mrs. Keene?" Brenda asked, pouring me a mug of decaf without asking. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Oh, Brenda," I sighed, leaning in and lowering my voice to a stage whisper. "I don't know if it's a ghost or a miracle. I was going through Marcus's old papers at the cabin. You know that old geological survey he commissioned back in the 90s? Brenda's ears practically perked up. She leaned over the counter, wiping the same spot of formica 3 times. "The one for the water table?" "That's what we thought," I said, looking around as if checking for spies. "But I found the unredacted copy. Apparently the surveyor found traces of lithium. Significant traces. They kept it quiet because the extraction tech wasn't there yet. But now, with the electric car boom?" I shook my head and let out a nervous laugh. "That muddy patch of land might be worth $5 million. Brenda's eyes went wide. "$5 million? And Caleb knows?" "I don't think so," I said. "He tried to buy it from me for pennies yesterday. I almost sold it to him just to get rid of the headache. Thank goodness I didn't sign anything." I finished my pie, quickly left a generous tip, and walked out. I knew exactly what would happen next. Brenda would text her sister, who worked at the realty office, who was dating the sheriff's deputy, who played golf with Caleb's assistant. The rumor would hit Caleb's desk before I even got back to the cabin. I was counting on his greed. Greed makes smart men stupid. It gives them tunnel vision. If he thought I was sitting on a lithium mine, he wouldn't just want the land, he would be obsessed with it. He would stop thinking about the audit and start thinking about the profit. I drove back to the cabin and waited. The retaliation began at dusk. First it was the noise. A drone appeared buzzing over the property line, hovering just above the trees like a giant angry hornet. It had a camera. He was watching me. He was trying to intimidate me to make me feel exposed. I simply waved at it and went inside. Then came the darkness. At 8 o'clock, I was sitting in the kitchen reading a book when the lights flickered and died. The refrigerator stopped its rattling hum. The sudden silence was heavy. I looked out the window. The rest of the houses across the lake were twinkling with light. This wasn't a grid failure. This was targeted. I didn't panic. I didn't stumble around in the dark whimpering. I had expected this. I reached into my bag and pulled out the camping lantern I had bought at the hardware store, along with a box of heavy-duty candles. I lit them one by one, placing them around the kitchen table. The cabin took on a warm, flickering glow. "Is that the best you can do, Caleb?" I whispered to the empty room. He wanted to flush me out. He wanted me to get scared of the dark and the cold and run back to the city, begging him to take the property off my hands. He didn't know that I had spent nights in freezing warehouses auditing inventory while hostile union bosses glared at me from the catwalks. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I sat down at the kitchen table in the pool of candlelight. It was time to set the physical trap. I took one of the blank notebooks I had found in the attic. I had my own red pen and a bottle of ink. I began to write. I wasn't writing a memoir. I was forging a ledger. I needed to create a trail that Caleb would follow. A trail that led nowhere, but would cost him everything to pursue. I used Marcus's handwriting style, which I had practiced for hours. I wrote entries dating back 5 years. Entry 4/12/2021. Liquidated the Zurich bonds. Converted to Bitcoin. Stored in Cold Wallet Alpha. Entry 6/15/2022. Added $2 million from the logistics sale to the fund. Current balance $50 million. I created a fiction of a secret fortune, a massive hidden stockpile of cryptocurrency that Marcus had allegedly squirreled away for a rainy day. And then at the very end of the notebook on the last page, I wrote a sequence of numbers. Access key part 1. Fake code. Access key part 2. Requires biometric confirmation or substantial buy-in fee to unlock the master node. It was technical gibberish, essentially. But it sounded real enough to someone like Caleb, who thought he knew everything about finance but actually relied on advisors. I was planting the idea that to get the $50 million he would need to put up some of his own money to unlock the transaction. It is the oldest con in the book, the Nigerian prince scam dressed up in a tuxedo. But Caleb was desperate. He needed liquidity to hide his embezzlement before the Omnicorp deal closed. If he thought he could grab $50 million in crypto, he would risk everything. I left the forged ledger on the coffee table. I positioned it so it looked like I had been studying it and had just stepped away. Then I went to the back door and unlocked it. It was a risk, a physical risk. But I knew Caleb. He wouldn't hire a hitman. That was too messy, and he was too cowardly for violence. He would come himself, or send a lackey to snoop. He would want to steal the deed or find the survey I had lied about. I went into the bedroom and sat in the rocking chair facing the door. I had my phone in my hand recording. I had a heavy brass lamp on the table next to me just in case. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. The temperature in the cabin was dropping. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders. I was the spider sitting in the center of the web. The bait was set. The rumor of the lithium was the smell of blood in the water. The fake ledger was the hook. Now I just had to wait for the shark to bite. I didn't have to wait long. Desperation speeds up the clock. It was just after midnight when I heard the tires crunching on the gravel. He didn't park in the driveway this time. He stopped down the road, likely hoping the noise of the wind would cover his approach. I sat in the darkened bedroom, the door cracked open just an inch, watching the sliver of the living room illuminated by the dying embers of the fireplace and the single candle I had left burning on the table. The back door handle jiggled. Then came the sound of a lock being picked, or rather, forced. Caleb wasn't a burglar. He was brute force in a silk tie. There was a snap, a grunt of frustration, and then the door creaked open. A beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the gloom. It swept across the peeling wallpaper, the dusty rug, and finally landed on the coffee table. Caleb stepped into the light. He was wearing dark clothes, a black raincoat that looked brand new, probably bought for this specific mission. He looked ridiculous, like a villain in a bad spy movie. He was wet, shivering, and clearly furious. He moved straight to the table. He ignored the antique vase. He ignored my purse, which was sitting on the chair. He went straight for the papers. He was looking for the lithium survey. Instead, he found the ledger. I held my breath. This was the pivot point. If he realized it was a plant, I was in trouble. An old woman alone in the woods with an angry man who knows he's been tricked is not a good survival scenario. He picked up the black notebook. He flipped it open. I saw his flashlight beam dancing over the pages. He stopped. He read. He flipped the page frantically. He read again. I saw his posture change. The tension in his shoulders dropped, replaced by a sudden electric stillness. He had found the crypto entries. The greed was taking hold. He wasn't thinking about lithium anymore. Lithium takes years to mine. Crypto is instant. $50 million just sitting there, waiting for a key. He pulled out his phone. He took pictures of the pages. Click, click, click. He was shaking. He was muttering to himself. I strained to hear. Old fool, he whispered, hiding it all this time. He reached the last page, the unlock instructions. He paused. He read it 3 times. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. He put it on speaker, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet cabin. "It's me," Caleb hissed. "Wake up. I found something. Forget the survey. It's bigger." Marcus had a cold wallet. 50 million. Yes, 50. But it's locked in a smart contract. I need to stake liquidity to release it. No, I don't have time to explain the blockchain to you. Just get the accounts ready. I'm going to transfer everything we have in the operational fund. Yes, all of it. We put it in, the contract unlocks, we get the 50 million, and we put the operational money back before the auditors arrive on Monday. It's a wash. Nobody will know. He was doing exactly what I hoped. He was going to drain the company's remaining legit funds to try and unlock a fortune that didn't exist. He was going to bankrupt himself chasing a phantom. He hung up the phone. He shoved the notebook into his coat pocket. He looked around the room one last time, sweeping the light over the shadows. For a second, the beam hit the bedroom door. I shrank back against the wall, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't check. He was too excited. He turned and hurried out the back door, leaving it swinging open in the wind. I waited until I heard the car start down the road and fade away. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. I walked out into the living room and closed the back door. I locked it and jammed a chair under the handle. I went to the window and looked out at the dark lake. He had taken the bait. He had swallowed the hook, line, and sinker. By tomorrow morning, he would have transferred the company's payroll, the vendor payments, and his own personal savings into a dead-end wallet address I had generated. A black hole wallet that looked like a holding escrow but was actually just a one-way burn address. The money wouldn't be stolen. It would effectively be destroyed. But the transaction record would prove he moved it. It would prove he drained the company accounts. He was going to wake up tomorrow expecting $50 million. Instead, he was going to wake up with $0 and a digital paper trail of embezzlement so clear a first-year accounting student could trace it. I picked up my phone. I had the recording of his phone call. I had the video of him breaking in. And I had the real evidence from the safe, the true history of his theft. It was 2:00 a.m. The board meeting with the Omnicorp representatives was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. I had 2 days to prepare my presentation. I wasn't just going to show up. I was going to perform. I was going to walk into that boardroom and dismantle him piece by piece. I sat down at the table and lit a fresh candle. I pulled out my laptop. I started drafting a new document. The title? Forensic Audit of Thorn Logistics, 2018 to 2024. Prepared by Elara Keene. The rain started again, gentle this time, a steady rhythm on the roof. It sounded like applause. Monday morning in Oak Haven was gray and blustery. The kind of weather that makes people hunch their shoulders and hurry inside. But I did not hurry. I drove my sedan to the corporate headquarters of Thorn Logistics, a glass and steel monstrosity that Marcus had built in the 90s. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in the forest. I arrived at 8:45 a.m. I was wearing my best suit, a charcoal gray number that I hadn't worn since my retirement party. I had my hair pulled back in a tight bun. I carried a leather briefcase that weighed 10 pounds, filled with paper and justice. The security guard at the front desk was new. He was young and looked bored. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Elara Keene," I said. "I'm a shareholder. I'm here for the board meeting." He looked up then, confused. He checked his list. I don't see your name on the guest list, ma'am. Mr. Thorne said only board members and the Omnicorp team. I own 20% of this company, I said, my voice cutting through the lobby chatter like a knife. That makes me a board member whether Mr. Thorne likes it or not. Check the bylaws if you want, or you can explain to the Omnicorp executives why you barred the founder's widow from the building. He hesitated, then buzzed me through. He didn't want a scene. I took the elevator to the top floor. The doors opened onto a plush reception area. I could hear voices coming from the conference room down the hall. I walked past the receptionist, who tried to stand up and stop me. I didn't even slow down. I pushed open the double mahogany doors. The room went silent. There were 12 people around the massive oval table. On one side sat the board of directors, men and women I had known for years, looking tired and anxious. On the other side sat the Omnicorp team, slick lawyers and analysts in sharp suits. And at the head of the table stood Caleb. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and clammy. He was sweating through his shirt. He must have just realized that the 50 million hadn't appeared. He must be checking his phone every 3 seconds, waiting for a confirmation that would never come. Aunt Elara, Caleb said, his voice cracking. What are you doing here? We're in the middle of a private meeting. I know, I said, walking to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. I set my briefcase down with a heavy thud. I'm here to assist with the due diligence. The lead negotiator for Omnicorp, a woman named Miss Vance with glasses sharp enough to cut glass, looked at me with interest. And you are? Elara Keene, I said, co-founder and former senior forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service. Caleb flinched. She's grieving, he said quickly, looking at Ms. Vance. She's confused. This is embarrassing. Please, let me escort her out. He started to move toward me. Sit down, Caleb, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. I used the voice I used when I caught a CEO lying about his offshore holdings. Unless you want me to play the recording of your phone call from Saturday night right now. Caleb froze. He looked at me, and he saw it. He saw that I knew. The color drained from his face completely. He sat down. I opened my briefcase. I passed a thick dossier to Ms. Vance. Then I passed one to the chairman of the board. What you have there, I began, addressing the room, is a reconciliation of the company's accounts over the last 5 years. You'll find that the profit margins haven't been shrinking due to market volatility, as Mr. Thorne has claimed in his reports. They have been shrinking because capital has been systematically siphoned into shell companies. I pointed to page 4. Here are the transfers, disguised as consulting fees. Vendor payments to companies that don't exist. Warehousing costs for inventory that was never purchased. Ms. Vance was flipping through the pages rapidly. Her eyebrows shot up. These are significant discrepancies. That's the history, I said. But the present is more interesting. If you check the company's primary operating account as of this morning, you will find it is empty. Gasps went around the table. The chairman grabbed his phone, presumably logging into the bank portal. Mr. Thorne, I continued, locking eyes with Caleb, emptied the accounts 48 hours ago. He transferred the funds to what he thought was a high-yield crypto investment to cover his previous thefts. Unfortunately for him, that investment was a fabrication. That's a lie, Caleb shouted, standing up. She's crazy. She's senile. She forged those documents. Did I forge this? I asked. I pulled out my phone and pressed play. Caleb's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. I'm going to transfer everything we have. We put it in, the contract unlocks. Nobody will know. Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Ms. Vance closed the dossier. She took off her glasses. She looked at Caleb with cold, professional disgust. Mr. Thorne, on behalf of Omnicorp, I am terminating these negotiations effective immediately. We do not acquire crime scenes. She stood up and signaled her team. They packed their bags in unison. The chairman of the board looked at Caleb. Caleb, he said, his voice shaking with rage. Is this true? Is the money gone? Caleb looked around the room. He looked at the door as if thinking about running. But he knew it was too late. He slumped back into his chair, defeated. I was going to fix it, he whispered. I just needed more time. Time is up, I said. I looked at the receptionist who was standing in the doorway, wide-eyed. Call the police, I said, and tell them to bring a forensic team. We have a lot of paperwork to go through. Caleb put his head in his hands. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt the satisfaction of a column finally summing to zero. The error had been found. The correction had been made. I closed my briefcase. My work here was done. The police arrived 10 minutes later. They were polite and professional, which somehow made it worse for Caleb. If they had been rough, he could have played the victim. But they simply treated him like what he was, a white-collar criminal who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I stood by the window and watched them lead him out of the building. He was still wearing that expensive suit, but now the jacket was bunched up around his shoulders and his wrists were cuffed behind his back. He looked up at the window. He couldn't see me through the reflective glass, but he knew I was there. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of an equation that finally resolves to zero. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and depositions. The fallout was messy, as it always is. The Omnicorp deal was dead and buried. The company's stock took a hit, but it didn't crash. It turned out that stripping the rot out of the organization was actually good for business. The board asked me to step in as interim CEO, but I refused. I had retired for a reason. Instead, I helped them promote the nervous CFO I had seen at the funeral. He was a good man. He was terrified of breaking the rules, which was exactly what the company needed right now. I had one final piece of business to attend to. The house. The estate on the cliff was now legally mine again, since Caleb's inheritance was voided by his criminal actions against the estate. I walked through the empty, echoing rooms. I looked at the marble floors that were too cold to walk on without slippers. I looked at the art on the walls that we had bought for investment, not for love. I called the real estate agent the same afternoon. I told him to sell it. I didn't care about the price. I just wanted it gone. I wanted to liquidate the asset. I took the proceeds from the sale of the house and the settlement from the recovery of Caleb's hidden accounts, and I drove back to Blackwood Lake. It was spring now. The rain had stopped, and the trees were exploding with green. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming wildflowers. The cabin was still there, sitting on its concrete pilings, looking slightly less forlorn in the sunlight. I hired a contractor, a local man named Sam who didn't ask too many questions. I told him I wanted everything fixed. I wanted a new roof. I wanted triple-pane windows to keep out the chill. I wanted the kitchen ripped out and replaced with warm oak cabinets and a stove big enough to cook a Thanksgiving dinner. I spent the next 3 months living in a small motel in town overseeing the work. It gave me something to do. It gave me a purpose. And every day I went to the site and watched the transformation. The rotting wood was replaced. The drafts were sealed. The darkness was chased away by new skylights that flooded the rooms with sun. When it was finally finished, I moved in. I unpacked the boxes I had saved. I put Marcus's favorite books on the new shelves by the fireplace. I hung the few pictures that actually meant something to us. The photo of us in Italy. The picture of us fishing on this very lake 30 years ago. The first night in the renovated cabin was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, lonely silence I had felt before. It was a peaceful silence. The sound of the lake lapping against the shore was a lullaby, not a threat. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the rocking chair by the fire. I had one last thing to do. I reached into my bag and pulled out the black notebook. The real one, the one Marcus had written. The evidence of his heartbreak and his betrayal. I held it in my hands for a long time. I thought about keeping it. I thought about locking it in the safe as a reminder of what had happened. But then I realized that would be keeping the debt on the books. As long as I held on to this, I was still auditing the past. I was still looking for errors. I wanted to close the account. I leaned forward and tossed the notebook into the fire. The pages curled and blackened. The ink bubbled. The words Caleb and theft and betrayal turned into smoke and drifted up the chimney, disappearing into the night sky. I watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. I took a sip of my tea. It was hot and sweet. I looked out the window at the moon reflecting on the water. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had my home. I had my dignity. And for the first time in a long time, the ledger was perfectly balanced. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Is justice always about punishment? Or is it sometimes just about setting the record straight? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.